Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pensive Politics, Mr. Watson. I am most certainly your host, Christian Watson, and today with me, I have a man who is about to unleash an intellectual salvo against one of the worst political tracts written in the past 2 years, a tract that has inspired a lot of people, particularly on the left, particularly people who see race as an all-encompassing idea, to use it to browbeat people into submission. I am speaking of none other than Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, released in 2018, which basically posits in a few words that white people don't like to talk about race because it somehow harms or offends them, and it allows them to, and it would allow them to keep white supremacy intact in society. Now, if you're like me and you're thinking to yourself, well, that is a big generalization and that is a very flawed statement. Well, according to DiAngelo and all of her followers, it's a statement that is simply self-evident, that does not need any challenge, does not need any sort of dissection, and that should stand on its own. But I don't think that is true, which is why I have with me Mr. Jonathan Church, who is actually writing a book about this, and he is giving a very philosophical, rigid critique of this idea. Mr. Church, how are you doing, sir?
Very good. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So why don't you tell my listeners for just in a few words, what motivated you to write this book? And in your words, in your opinion, what exactly does white fragility mean?
Well, the impetus for the book came, I guess, August 2018. Although I didn't think about writing a book at the time. I was writing weekly columns for the Good Med Project, and it's a pretty progressive outlet. Writes a lot of stuff on social justice issues. And I wouldn't say that I'm a social justice warrior, but there are various issues in social justice that, I support, and there's other issues that I'm a little bit more skeptical of. And so, I was writing various articles, some in support and some not in support. And one article in particular I wrote was expressing concern about a tendency for confirmation bias among social justice activists. And so I sent that article to someone in my family who's very active in social justice circles. And the response I got was essentially, why do you always get worked up when issues like white privilege and other stuff come up? Which I don't, because I had already written a few articles at that point laying out a Bayesian conception of white privilege, but basically saying, there is a there, although again, in line with sort of confirmation bias, you have to be very cautious about, not over applying it. But at any rate, there was a pushback that says, why are you so fragile? And, I tried to essentially, argue in good faith and try to describe my critique, but there really wasn't any good faith engagement coming from the other side. It was always, why are you so fragile, and so on. So essentially what you have is probably what everybody recognizes as the at least the first fundamental problem with white fragility that strikes everyone is that it's a Kafka trap, which is that, you can't really get out of the trap of being labeled as fragile for raising any kind of question about white fragility and theory in general, with social justice activism in general.
If I might add, that kind of goes into its unfalsifiability. Sorry, that's a very word. Unfalsifiability.
Yeah, I have a bit of a slight stutter, so I can sympathize. But but yes, that's right. It's the falsification principle. So at any rate, obviously that was frustrating, and so I started looking into the theory. And a couple of weeks later, I published my first article on it, Roulette, the problem with white fragility theory, and essentially laying out that case, but also invoking some of the literature on implicit bias, saying that one of the core premises of white fragility theory is that of implicit bias, and apparently there's a whole second generation of research that's come out, sort of really called into question the whole paradigm. Anyway, that was what the article was about. But curiosity kills a cat. I kept investigating and wrote another fairly lengthy essay in December 2018, followed very quickly by another analyzing her take on a Jeopardy episode as illustrating white racial illiteracy. And over the next couple of years, just generated a series of essays. Earlier this year, I started thinking about putting it together into a book, and just got a bit of luck through a contact who connected me with Roman Littlefield, and they were interested. In fact, it was Chris Pasley, who's also got a book coming out. So both our books being published by Roman and Littlefield. So those are two books coming out critiquing white fragility. And so that's how I arrived at the writing of a book. And so essentially, I essentially assembled a lot of my critiques and amplified and fleshed it out and added and tried to create as rigorous and comprehensive critique as I could in the book. And now it's finished. It's been submitted. It's in production or in press, I guess, tentatively scheduled for January publication. So white fragility, I guess the way to start is really just to quote directly from DiAngelo. Everybody's probably heard this by now. And she describes it as a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves, including the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, guilt, behaviors like argumentation, silence, leaving the stress-inducing situation, all of which firing a wide gamut of reactions, anything from fear to just shutting up to leaving. And that's from her 2011 seminal paper, International Journal of Critical Pedagogy. But it actually first shows up, and it might even show up before this, but it first shows up in her 2004 PhD dissertation, as far as I'm aware of, in which she does this long analysis of 2-hour sessions of interracial dialogue, and she describes situations like this. And in fact, in my opinion, most of her subsequent academic work, activist work, virtually everything she does really is foreseen in the dissertation. It's just an extension of her dissertation. And it's these talks and dialogues and everything that she conducts as a facilitator or as a mediator, that's what she does. And now she is, sort of converted into a full-time business, I guess you could say. As the more cynical people would say that it's all business. But white fragility for her is she goes into a room and she has an idea of what systemic racism or what racism is and how whiteness keeps it in place. And she wants to explain to her audience how that works. And when anybody gets a little defensive or skeptical or, I don't know, outraged or whatever, for her, they're exhibiting white fragility. And that's essentially what she means by white fragility. I could go on and on, but I mean, that's essentially, I think, what everybody now understands as her central idea.
And to be clear here, these emotions, this rage, this frustration that is brought about through the discussion of race, she is particularizing and aiming her target, her analysis, particularly at a white individual's expression of those emotions. When in all reality, those emotions, everyone experiences them, everyone feels them, everyone expresses them. So she's really operating within this construct that she's made that particularizes and consigns these emotions to white people as a sort of villainization tactic almost. Why do you think she's doing this? Why do you, if you can divine sort of the reason, and as a sort of addendum to this question, would you say, and we're going to get into this a little bit more later, this is reflective of a key facet of critical race theory, which DiAngelo wielded like a great sword throughout the duration of this work?
So before I directly address the question, hopefully I won't forget exactly the exact words, but I think I smiled, but you said exactly point that I was making in the first essay I wrote for Colette, which is that this is supposed to be a white thing, but it's actually really kind of universal thing. In other words, psychological defense mechanisms are pretty common in human nature. So those types of emotional reactions are just totally not to be, are not totally not unexpected. Did I say that correctly? So yeah, that's the first thing that strikes us. I mean, it's not that deep, it's not that profound, but she wants to essentially incorporate this into a critical race theory paradigm or framework for understanding how racism works.
And explain to folks, if you could, in your analysis, what critical race theory is, because it's very archaic to many, not archaic, it's very unknown and esoteric to many folks, but it is a very powerful cultural concept in America. So if you could explain, well, what exactly we mean when we say that.
Yeah, so I'm tempted to just kind of boil it down to a few words, but I feel like that would maybe shortchange it a little bit.
That's all right.
But I don't want to go on too long. But maybe the best way to think about is first to invoke its heritage in people like Derek Bell and I believe Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw and so on. So the point being that it comes out of a critical legal theory tradition. It was basically developed by lawyers, people who were looking at legal institutions and trying to critique them in a new way, unique to understanding how racial inequality persists within our ongoing institutions, in particular legal institutions. The word critical goes back a little bit far, or back maybe half century farther to the Frankfurt School, who were a group of German philosophers emigrated to the U.S. During World War II, and they set up the Institute for Social Research. I think that's what it's called. Max Horkheimer, Theodore Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, people that became affiliated with the New Left, and they were essentially interested in critiquing society. They were neo-Marxists with a specific focus on critiquing capitalism and things like false consciousness, ideology, class structure, and all that. Those are sort of concepts that were important for them. So that's sort of where critical theory originally comes from, but it then sort of takes on different, it branches off in a lot of different ways throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and critical race theory is one of those branches. And, it's fairly complicated when you try to thread or put together all the various threads.
Would you say a good, would you say a good, sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
Yeah, would you say a good explanation of critical race theory, like if you're just going to boil it down and make it very compact, would be it is an idea of analyzing society primarily through, and so particularly society and social relations, primarily through the lens of race, with a sort of deconstructionist idea, which means to tear down everything, to tear down institutions, to tear down broader ideas, and to boil it down indeed to race. Not only is race the lens, but it is also the end result as well.
Yeah, so if you really want to boil it down, it's about power and privilege. Essentially all of racial inequality, anything that you want to talk about in terms of knowledge, in terms of how we understand race. So yeah, it is through the lens of race, but essentially in trying to understand race and in trying to understand racial inequality, that you have to understand it as a social construct, and that it is not something that is, so race is not some kind of, essentialist biological category, but it's constructed through institutions and the way we interact with each other and so on, through, ideologies and more particularly even discourse as we sort of move forward. But it's about power and privilege. Everything that we talk about everything in society, our positions, and positionality is a key word. How we function in society is inevitably filtered through power and privilege. And when you talk about, that's critical theory. And we talk about critical race theory, it's power and privilege as applied to race. So when you mention deconstruction, deconstruction actually has a sort of very precise meaning in the philosophical sense, which is that everything's built on hierarchies. So you can't say underprivileged without implicitly referring to privileged. You can't refer to words are always defined by their difference from other words, and that you have essentially conceptual binaries: black, white, privileged, underprivileged, so on, and that within these binaries are built-in hierarchies. So white at the top, black at the bottom, privilege at the top, underprivileged. This is in some sense drawing on queer theory as well, ideas about normativity. But yeah, critical theory is about analyzing social structure, and particularly with an eye towards diagnosing domination and oppression and marginalization. Critical race theory is the same thing as applies specifically to race.
And so how does DiAngelo wield these things in her construction of the word whiteness and her imposition upon all white folks, these nasty qualities she proclaims they have whenever a discussion about race is imminent?
Yeah, so the way whiteness factors into white or critical race theory is that whiteness is essentially the scaffold on which oppression and marginalization are built. When we talk about, so whiteness is just the idea that the structures of domination and marginalization, or the social structures which institute or keep in place inequality, oppression, marginalization. Whiteness is the set of ideologies, discourses that keep that all that in place. We want to flesh out what whiteness is, but if there's a sort of takeaway phrase or whatever, whiteness is a core focus of critical race theory, in the sense that whiteness is what keeps it all together: white supremacy, racial inequality, and so on. So then the question is, what is whiteness? And this is, in some sense, a question that, as I argue, but I think whiteness scholars themselves would probably agree to some extent, is really not fully or well defined. It's more of an object of critique as opposed to a well-specified, well-defined concept. But so it's really about the technique, I guess, the approach. And the issue is, and this is perhaps why white fragility is ultimately so divisive. In fact, that's what I'll ultimately argue, is that you have this idea that white people talk in certain ways and interact in certain ways and just go about living their everyday lives. And virtually every aspect, get direct quotes from many people on this, pretty much every aspect of that, of their lives, is in some central or roundabout way keeping racial inequality in place. And so whiteness studies is saying that in order to understand racism and racial inequality, we no longer have to focus on racism as a problem for non-white people. We have to focus on racism as a problem for white people. And that it's no longer trying to just simply widen the circle of inclusion, bring advocate for diversity, inclusion, whatever, but white people themselves have to think about what it means to be white, and inevitably in ways that what it means to be white contributes to racial inequality. And that means how we think, and that's where implicit bias comes in. That's where discourse comes in. That's where ideology comes in. So in that sense, it's drawing on the sort of neo-Marxian tradition of Gramsci and whatever, cultural hegemony.
Hegemony meaning power, correct? Hegemony meaning power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah. So I mean, critical race theory, strictly speaking, is a break from Marx, just like postmodernism, whatever. But it is nevertheless carrying on the tradition of social critique, and with a focus on sort of this sort of false consciousness, whereas Marx is talking in some sense about the false consciousness of the oppressed. Whiteness studies wants to shift the focus on the quote-unquote false consciousness of the oppressors.
And
so
they assume that all the oppressors, or the oppressors themselves, their defining quality is their whiteness, basically.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yep, that's right. And so that's what whiteness is about. It's really like James Baldwin, I think he wrote something called The Price of the Ticket, and you can understand that as saying that the price of a ticket into America is whiteness, and sort of being able to adapt to, and so when we're talking about the past, the 19th century, even much of the 20th century, where racism is a real issue in terms of how we traditionally understand it, as DiAngelo would say, the good, bad binary, that it's about prejudicial acts against people. That's when, we're really talking about real racism. And, but now that is, in DiAngelo's view and others, it's really quite something, but that is more of an adaptation of racism. In other words, to think about racism in that way is to further reify, quote unquote, racism, because it obscures the so-called, the systemic nature of it. So that I'm sort of leading us towards the reification fallacy, which I see as the core problem.
Yeah, and just real quick, define reify for my audience.
Yep. So reification is probably best. I mean, it's the idea that an abstraction cannot be take on or an material. There was this nice phrase that Helen Clockworth. But anyway, it's the idea of an abstraction cannot take on material existence.
Right. So this idea that this broad idea, this idea that's up there somewhere up in the ether of ideaism, cannot come down and be manifest in reality, basically.
Yeah. Another rephrasing of the reification fallacy is the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Now, one of my favorite phrases from the show Mad Men was when Don Draper says the universe is indifferent. So the universe is this, abstract idea of, the cosmos and whatever. And it's literally not true that the universe can be indifferent about anything. That's just personify the universe. Now, metaphorically, and this is sort of why you have to be, you have to explain this carefully and acknowledge a few things, which is that metaphorically, it makes sense, and that's why people use it. We say that the universe is indifferent, we kind of have some intuitive grasp of what Don Draper was saying. And when we say, whiteness is percolating through our institutions and affecting how people think and whatever, we have some idea metaphorically of what's being said. But logically speaking, it's fallacious. It's just not. It's just wrong to argue that. Now, I guess you could say, why is that the case? Well, we've already been saying so by zooming in, no pun intended there, on the idea that it's very hard to define what whiteness actually is. So what we kind of have is a problem of identifying what we call in statistics false positives and false negatives. The confirmation bias is the idea. So best way, and I quote him a lot, even though it's only one sentence, but there's a labor historian Eric Arsener or whatever, and he said that, essentially whiteness becomes a blank screen onto which we project whatever it is that we see as whiteness, and I'm paraphrasing him. In other words, it's ambiguous. And so when we say that whiteness is just, in fact, why don't I just quote DiAngelo here? So for DiAngelo, whiteness is conceptualized as a constellation of processes and practices rather than as a discrete entity. Whiteness is dynamic, relational, and operating at all times and on myriad levels. These processes and practices include basic rights, values, beliefs, perspectives, and experiences, and so on and so forth. So the issue is that whiteness is kind of like a standpoint. It's a positionality, and it's defined by the way the people at the center, white people, think and act. Yeah, that the reification idea is that this abstract notion of whiteness consisting of positionality, ideology, discourses, whatever, is kind of lurking around as a concrete personification or a concrete thing that's kind of whispering into the ears of white people, telling them to act and talk in certain ways that reinforce racial inequality. And that's just logically fallacious, even if it's metaphorically vivid. But where it really becomes a problem is if we really don't have a very clearly specified notion of whiteness, we run into the fallacy of ambiguity. And the fallacy of ambiguity is when you have an argument, syllogism of some sort, premise leads to the conclusion, and the premise has some kind of term, has some term that's ill-defined. In this case, it would be whiteness. So for critical race theory, whiteness scholars in particular, and they say whiteness is the scaffold on which all of racial inequality is built, we're saying that whiteness leads to or sustains racial inequality. But if whiteness is ill-defined, then you have a problem in the premise. You have a fallacy of ambiguity. I talk about that in the book. But that strikes me as the core challenge, shortcoming, if you will, of whiteness studies.
So and so basically, this idea of whiteness as brought forth by DiAngelo basically says that whiteness is this all-encompassing force which surrounds and subsumes everything within it. And so this is part of the problem. This is, of course, this you bring out a lot of there's a lot of logical problem with this, obviously, but also a sort of like metaphysical grand problem, in my opinion, as well. It's reducing all of reality to a singular quality that is inactive. Whiteness, whatever it is, and from what I see, whiteness is a color. And whiteness, and of course, she says it's more than that. It's a social sort of action. But whiteness itself, in all reality, is merely a color. It's a complexion. It is inactive in and of itself. There are individuals happen to be white, but there is no, sort of like animate being that is whiteness. And so she is making sort of ontological and a metaphysical sort of fallacy here by saying that whiteness literally subsumes and consumes everything and not giving credit or giving credence to anything else that may be affecting what she's actually talking about. Your thoughts?
Yeah, monocausality is a real big problem in all the omitted variable bias and whatever. But the idea is that whiteness becomes the be-all and end-all of the story, and that and this is a problem with Kendi as well. But it's almost very circular in a sense. It's tautological. So, for instance, in her seminal paper, she writes that whiteness studies begin with the premise that racism and white privilege exist in both traditional and modern forms. And rather than work to prove its existence, work to reveal it. So that sentence is essentially saying that racism is a function of whiteness, white privilege, and that's what you start with as the premise. And then we're going to go about just trying to reveal it. And that another way of saying that, which comes up in a lot of in DiAngelo's work and in statements that she's written with other people, is that the question is not, did racism manifest itself, but how did it manifest in this situation? So tautology is one word that comes to mind in all this. We just assume that racism is there and whiteness is everywhere and anywhere. And for them, that means we have to go and seek it out. For me, that just means that it sort of lost its meaning. But yeah, it's this all-encompassing abstraction that's supposed to be walking around in every aspect of society, which is, just kind of, it's
ridiculous is what it is.
Yeah, nonsense.
Absolutely.
I was going to say nonsensical, but I mean, so I do try to be fair. I'm going to get up one more time so now I can pull up the blinds. But I didn't want. I try to be fair. I mean,
Yeah.
I try
absolutely.
to give. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think the sort of the height of intellectualism and the height of intellectual honesty and philosophical discourse is listening to the other person. And as the great Roger Scruton once said, trying to embody the sort of perspectives and the life of the other person in a temporal moment, and then pushing all that stuff out and interpreting it within your mind, within your experience, in accordance to something that's higher than yourself, reason or what have you. As Kant would say, there's nothing higher than reason in his opinion. And so I think that is what animates me and what drives me. But nonsense is nonsense. And so, and in my opinion, DiAngelo and her theories are just the height of nonsense. So wait, let's talk about, we got to wrap up a little bit here because we're going over time a little bit. Let's talk about white privilege though. What does DiAngelo say about white privilege, and what are your arguments against what she says about white privilege?
I think that the problem I would say with the white privilege paradigm is, again, the monocausality, is the extent to which and also you also get into problems of reverse causation. Is something within society causing white privilege, or is white privilege causing the inequality? So is white privilege a function of inequality or a cause of inequality? And you'd have to. I don't want to go on too long, but you have to unpack that and all that. But the short answer is, I think you get with DiAngelo, it's the problem of monocausality, that white privilege is everything and anything, just like whiteness, or as an extension of whiteness. And for me, you just have to be, you have to think very, very carefully about any particular issue. Every issue, if you're a true scholar, if you're somebody in an academic position trying to make a career out of a research question, you know how complex a task it is to simply formulate a hypothesis, to come up with a specific question from all the mountains of chaos and noise out there, to come up with a question that really concretely addresses a problem. That in itself is an enormous undertaking. And then to go about trying to methodologically address, like white flight, for instance. There's great research by Leah Boustan, if I got that correctly, or the pronunciation, at Princeton, who looks at white flight. And for DiAngelo, she says in her book, it's all residential segregation is explained by white flight. So in other words, just white people are not wanting to be around non-white people. Leah Boustan did some real extensive research on this and says, she quantifies the number of white people who migrated to the suburbs per black migrant to the northern cities and so on. But for her, yes, some of this was a function of aversion to diversity. Some of it was essentially socioeconomic, and a lot of migrants were going from all white communities to other all white communities, and it wasn't simply that there were more non-white people in that community and they moved out. So anyway, the point is, it's very complicated, and when you address these really complicated social issues of race and inequality, you just have to recognize that these are extremely multidimensional problems, and that they don't all come down to simply reified whiteness or white privilege. That's really where I'm coming
All right, excellent. Yes, very good analysis. Well, Mr. Church, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us, talking to me. I appreciate your perspectives. And where can people get your book when it's available?
Well, Amazon for sure. There's also the Roman Littlefield website. I guess those are the two major places you want to go. And then, wherever they are, wherever it is in big bookstores, but I haven't gotten to the point where that is. And yeah, sorry if I would just go on at length. I can talk about this all day long.
All right. That's why you're writing about it, and that's why I'm happy to have a great mind like you on this show. All right,
I
guys.
appreciate.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, just I appreciate the comment. Same to you, and I'm glad that you brought up Roger Scruton too, because it's the name that I'm starting to become more familiar with. But anyway, yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. He's one of the, and I am a more right-leaning libertarian with some conservative sensibilities, but even from my disposition, I can appreciate that he is one of the greatest contemporary conservative minds, perhaps barring Russell Kirk. And
Oh,
yeah.
I did read your article for the Foundation of Economics and Education, I think, on
Yes.
yeah, on the hate crime legislation in
Oh,
Georgia. That was a
yes. What'd you think about that?
that was a very good analysis. Because yeah, again, I don't want to take up your time here, but
No,
uh,
absolutely not.
it,
No, come on,
it,
please.
it certainly is a reasonable question to ask, whether because of the subjectivity behind what constitutes a hate crime and whatever, versus more objective issue of let's apprehend somebody and prosecute them, the person who's responsible. And in other words, I'm much more concerned about somebody not lighting up my house on fire than I am about whether he does so with a Nazi flag or something. In other
Precisely,
words, yeah,
precisely. It's the issue of materialization over
yeah,
abstraction, so to speak. That's really.
exactly.
But when you say that, some people get nervous and they're like, "What do you mean?" But so I thank you for that. Writing is taking a little bit of a back seat in my career. This podcast is more, but as time goes on, I'm going to keep writing more because I think that the written word is very important for the exhibition of ideas. If we didn't
Yeah.
have the written word, philosophy would be incomplete. The history of philosophy would be incomplete. So thank you
All
so
right.
much,
Well, thank
Mr.
you
Church.
again.
Absolutely. And everyone, all of you, please indeed subscribe wherever you are, YouTube, podcast, whatever. But until next time, please stay pensive.